Okay, so last lecture for the course is on the COMP6080 COMP6080 final exam. This is a very short lecture and it's really just a chance to talk through what's on the exam page because there's always going to be a little bit of nuance with what's here. So I'm just going to kind of systematically go through each section. And if you have questions, feel free to just type in the chat and we can get those answered for you. There is a light flickering. I'm hoping it will stay on soon. Okay, so first things first, in terms of the COMP6080 final exam, there is a requirement that you have stable internet to complete the exam. This is important because not having stable internet where it was knowably a problem is not really grounds for special consideration. And what I mean by that is that if you kind of have internet problems during the exam and you turn around and say, yeah, look, I'm having some trouble, the Wi-Fi is just really bad from my bedroom, that's not going to be grounds for special consideration because, you know, it was kind of a preventable problem. So if you don't have a stable internet connection or you don't feel confident of it, then now's the time to, you know, go to a library, go to a friend's house, go to a family, you know, someone else in your family's house, go to another room in the house. That's all stuff that you can do in advance. Now, when you also start the exam, it's important that you don't just have a stable internet connection, but that you also have, you're also of good health. One thing about the UNSW rules is that it requires that if you start the exam, we expect that you're healthy enough to start the exam. What that means is that if the exam's on a Monday and you kind of the night before had a massive headache, that you're not allowed to kind of start the exam and then halfway through the exam be like, oh, actually I feel really sick, here's like a medical certificate from yesterday, you know? It's kind of like a thing where it's like pre-existing conditions don't really apply. And sorry, just cough. But what is an exception is if you actually fall ill during the exam. So if the exam starts at 2 p.m. and come 3 p.m. you have a really bad headache and you're going to go see the doctor and you want to sit a supplementary exam, then that's okay. And in those cases, just email me directly, CS6080. It's pretty much the only time we really want you to email me throughout the course, throughout the exam, sorry. So keep that in mind. So make sure you're healthy, make sure your internet is good. Now, if you are a student who is an undergrad and has done COMP1531 before, a lot of this lecture is going to be very similar, so you can probably kind of gloss through it or just read what's written here. And that's like 2/3 of you, so that's okay. In terms of the final exam, it will be a 3-hour exam on the Monday of, I think that's effectively that's week 13. But, you know, it's 3 weeks from yesterday. Yeah, it's 3 weeks from yesterday. So it's in 20 days. It is from 2 in the afternoon to 5 in the afternoon Sydney time. If you're outside of Sydney or Australia, generally you can still sit the exam at the same time. And that's kind of true for pretty much everyone in Indo-Asia as well. The only times where we maybe make exceptions for exam adjustments if you are in like the US or Europe, like if you're in North or South America or Europe, Africa. If you are one of those students who lives there, email me and we'll talk about adjustments for timing. We'll figure that out as we go, you know. But point is that most of you should be able to sit that exam perfectly fine. Also, we can't move your exam if you have an exam in that morning or if you have work or something like that. So I don't have any control over that most of the time. Alright, so in terms of exam structure, the exam's going to be worth about, it's worth X marks. That X doesn't really matter. But it's worth 20% of the course. Now, 20% of the course isn't very much, so it's very relaxing in that sense. It's smaller than assignment 3, it's smaller than assignment 2. But those X marks for that 20% of the course are basically going to be made up of 2 key sections, which is 80% providing like features and functionality that we ask you to do. Basically, think like milestones or feature sets in assignment 2 or 3. And 20% of it is for responsiveness, right? So most of the exam is basically going to be asking you to do things in React. But there are some obvious and clear differences. One of the first ones is that in the final exam, it's going to be substantially less work than assignment 3, naturally. That's good, because otherwise it'd be impossible. Um, it's not going to be assessed in terms of linting, code design, accessibility, and UI UX. We will not look at the source code that you submit. The reason for this is pretty simple. We think there's some value in asking you to try and produce work in a timed environment, particularly if it's open book, because that is somewhat an actual, useful reflective learning outcome. And that happens in the real world a bunch. But what doesn't happen in the real world is people asking you to do things quickly and well. Like in the real world, either you kind of get asked to be like, you need to rush this, or you need to get it done properly. So therefore, we don't really look at things like, we're not going to look at your code, the code style. We're not going to lint your code. We're not going to look at accessibility, UI, UX. And we also aren't going to have a back-end attached. This is just to simplify things further. So it'll all be purely front-end based. But besides that, it's pretty similar to assignment 3. You are allowed to use your code from other assessments. So assignment 1, 2, or 3, you're welcome to copy and paste as much of that as you'd like. That's totally up to you. And then in terms of the platform for the final exam, we will distribute it on GitLab, like we do with your assignment. So you know how we kind of give you assignment 1, assignment 2, assignment 3. We're also going to give you like an exam, an exam repo that you'll be able to clone. And it's super, super similar in the sense that you basically just push your code to master. The main difference with the final exam is that there won't be an explicit submit command, but there will... we will require that you push things to master. If you do complete the exam locally instead of VLab, which is the majority of you, make sure that you've really nailed out any technical issues you have with your local computer, because they're generally not grounds for special consideration either, unless it's quite extreme. So make sure you're comfortable. And most of you would be, because you've done assignment 3 on it. So that's more of a disclaimer than something you should probably particularly worry about. Mike says, will there be any exam questions like tic-tac-toe or 2048, something like a game? Yeah, there quite possibly will be. Yep, definitely. You'll see the sample exam. We'll talk about that in a sec. Don't leave it till the last minute to push your code to master. Push regularly, push after each half an hour. It doesn't matter if it's incomplete. But push regularly, because if you've pushed at like 4:50 p.m., and then you do a bit more work, and then you push that last 10 minutes of work and something goes wrong, you'll feel a lot less stressed than if you never push until right at the end. Because if you haven't pushed, as far as we're concerned, you haven't done the work. So keep that in mind. Now, during the final exam, it is an open book exam, so you can use the internet and other resources. Whilst you can use the internet, you can't copy or plagiarize material on the internet. The only code you can kind of copy verbatim is your own work or any material we give you in the course, exercises, lectures, etc. You're prohibited from seeking help from other students during the exam. Basically, any communication you have with other students during the exam is not allowed, and it will result in a 0 for the exam. Even after you finish the exam, on the day of the exam, we got another repeat there. Do not communicate your exam answers to anyone. Some students have extended time. This happened last term, I think. I can't remember when it happened, but one student finished the exam. They sent their answers to a friend. Their friend had extra time for various reasons, and both of them got hit for plagiarism. A deliberate violation of exam conditions will be referred to UNSW, and it may result in 0 for the course, particularly for serious offences, so please keep that in mind. If you do have questions or clarifications that you want to make during the exam, maybe a particular question doesn't make sense, then you can make a private post on our forum. It's just the usual forum that we've been using all term. If you haven't signed up to the forum, it's important you go sign up to it now, but 95% of you would have. During the exam, all posts will be automatically private, so therefore nothing will be shared, which is how we design it. Don't email me during the exam for questions or clarifications. Don't email tutors or lecturers. Don't reach out to anyone via MS Teams. Pretty much all communication, except for special consideration stuff up the top, is to be done via the ed forum during the final exam. If you do post a question, it's really important that you try and make your question as understandable as possible, because it helps us answer your question quicker. So make sure that you show screenshots of the issue, explain how you produced it, tell us whether you're running locally or in VLab, just those basic things. If you don't do that, you're not going to get in trouble, but it may make it harder for you to get a response, because every time you say something vague, a tutor's going to have to come and ask you to clarify, which is then going to, essentially cause a delay there. So that matters a bit. Clarifications made during the exam will be at the top of this page. This particular statement is wrong. It's actually going to be written at the top of the exam page. I'll fix that up. But after each clarification that we make in the exam, we will send an email to all students so that you're aware of it. So the point with that is that make sure you monitor your email throughout the exam. That's the point there. There is no submit command for the final exam. It's what we said before. We'll just take whatever's on master at the end time at 5 p.m. So please keep that in mind. And if you are an ELS student, if you don't know what that is, you're not one probably. The extra time that you get is kind of trickled through the uni down to the school, down to me, and I'll send you an email some few days before the exam confirming the exact time. There are some troubleshooting tips here, which you might find particularly helpful, just around if you have issues with VLab or VS Code. But the main thing in terms of preparing for the final exam is that you can review your exercises, right? Because remember, there's this exercises repo that you all have. There's tons and tons and tons of stuff in here, and they all have solutions, except that one, I guess. They all have solutions, so you can kind of go and get familiar. So go and study those if you feel like you need the help. And then also importantly, there is an exam sample spec that you can go and look at and you can go and attempt. The final exam will be quite familiar to this one. Particularly like sections 2, 3, and 4 are the same. Section 1, the only difference is that we ask you to do different things. But the sample exam is really, really good to get familiar with the kind of exam you're going to have in terms of what kinds of questions we ask, how complicated they're going to be, etc. So you can see here that for each we ask you to do some sections, and each section is worth a total number of marks, and then each thing we want you to do is broken up into a specific number of marks. So it's actually very kind of compartmentalized, and we do that so that as you do this exam, it should feel that you're ticking off things, checking off things. And similarly, that's how your tutor's going to mark it as well. They'll be kind of checking off things one by one. You'll see that some of the more complicated things we ask you to do, there is a YouTube video that shows you how to do it. So you can kind of go and watch this. And there'll be some explanation there, which should be really useful. And yeah, that's actually about it. Probably the only subtle thing to note here is that the exam spec repo, and you'll get a similar one for the final exam that's not a sample one, you don't actually do the work in this repo. So this spec repo is not to be cloned. It's just kind of a static page on GitLab. What we actually do is that we send you to I'll show you what the last term looked like. We actually give you... Okay, one sec. We give you a repo. I'll send this out. Not sure what happened here. That kind of looks like this, which is basically just a blank React app. So all this is having run create React app, and we just give that to you. So you actually will all get a copy of this repo, and you all go and clone that yourself, and that's where you do the work. So there'll be the spec repo, which you don't have a copy of. It's just one repo that you can load on GitLab. That's where the instructions are, and then this is the repo you do the actual work in. The sample exam repo will be deployed out to your repos overnight, as in you'll have a copy of this for the sample exam. And we'll do the exact same thing with the final exam. So this is really useful because what this means is that if you actually go through the motions of, cloning the exam sample, running yarn, installing it, doing the answers, pushing it back up to GitLab, you've actually gotten completely comfortable with what we're asking of you for the final exam. You've kind of done it all, which is very, very powerful. So there's not a lot to worry about. But that's the sample exam. It is about a similar size. Look, the sample exam itself is relatively long, right? In the sense that it'll feel like there's a lot to do in the time frame you have. What I want to point out, and I point this out every term, is that in a normal course, there's a bit of a conundrum with 6080, which is that because it's a front-end course, problems are kind of solved or they're not. You kind of know where they're solved. Like if you think about a course like data structures and algorithms, you can write a quick sort or a merge sort that looks like it works, but because it's very abstract, you don't really know if it works, and the auto marker might hit you down. Front-end is a whole different part of software development. It's like a breadth subject. There's a lot of little things to do. But and one benefit of this is that when we ask you to do something like, make a page on a unique route, or to, when a button is pressed, move the grid somehow, you can actually do it and see that you've done it, and then you get the mark. So there's a much higher degree of certainty with front end in general, because it's if this makes sense, you can implement a quick sort. You can think it's working, but you won't know, so you'll move on. Whereas if you kind of had like the dry runs or the auto markers throughout the exam to write a quick sort, you'd probably get stuck in and keep going and keep trying to solve it. So there's a certain amount of like ignorance that exists that allows you to finish an exam thinking you did everything, and then you get your mark and it's a bit lower than you'd expect. But that's not the case for 6080. Therefore, it's going to feel long because you can see whether you've gotten the mark. And if you take that assumption further, what that means is that if you do, like what I've often said to students is that in a 6080 assignment or exam, if you do a thing, you've gotten the mark, right? There's not that gap between I did it, but I got it wrong. It's like if you do it, you got it right because you did it, you finished it. Therefore, the natural form of assessment is to provide you with a reasonable volume of work where the students who know the material and understand how to solve problems quickly, they will just move faster because they'll have to Google less, they'll debug less, they'll remember more, they will solve problems with less confusion. So the way that your competency and experience and intelligence actually manifests itself is by allowing you to tick through things. So the average student should not expect themselves to actually finish this exam in the 3 hours. There are definitely students who do. We've always seen students who do finish this exam, though generally like your average student will kind of do about I'd say like half. And if we find that lots of students don't get a lot done, then we scale the marks. We just scale them up accordingly. So don't feel stressed about it, because if we find that everyone is a lower average than we want, we just boost people up. Yeah. Okay, any questions about any of this? Because I think I've said everything about the exam. We have a pretty low attendance tonight, which makes sense because people are focusing on assignment 3. But because of that, we haven't had many questions. So normally this takes an hour, but we plowed through it in about 20 minutes. So I'll take a quick pause to see if people have questions. Mike says, is the exam difficulty similar to the sample one? Yes, it is. Jay says, hi Hayden, does the 3-hour exam time include reading time for the spec? Yes, exactly. Tanya says, can you give us areas of focus more than the whole exercises repo? Maybe anything that is React.js based or CSS based that is a recommended activity, if that makes sense. That's probably the main stuff. I reckon you could trim that down a bit and really focus just on that. Mike says, and what if GitLab is down somehow? Oh, we'll deal with that as it comes. I don't want to get into what if. If things go wrong, we figure them out as we go. And there's clear communication. So we'll see. If something weird happens during the exam, equals could go down, something could go down. We'll figure that out. Cool. Any other questions? Um, any suggestions of the unit testing of assignment 3? A really good, easy component test is I think one of the most common problems we see is that students tend to have these pages, and these pages just consist of Material UI buttons and other form elements. What I'd say is that look at your code, and you'll often see that your pages are quite large, and your pages could probably be broken up into smaller components. You know, like a header, or a card box, which consists of a card and something else. And most of those things, if you can get them small enough, you can test them. But what I'd probably say is that the best components to test are small components that you've made that have props. Because there's basically going to have to be some components that you've made that have props. So if you see a component, a small one you've made that has props, then it's like, great. You can go component test that. You can go look at the exercises or the lectures for some examples about how to component test it. That's probably the advice I'd say. Jay says, is the percent for the My Experience response out? No, I think My Experience closes in like 9 days or something. It's like next Thursday. And so we're not going to know how much extra time we get until then. And at that point, I will email everyone and let them know. Cool. Any other questions? Yep. Mike says, so we can use universal CSS in the final exam. Yes, we're not going to look at your source code. You can do anything you want. You could build it in vanilla JavaScript too. I just wouldn't recommend that. Jay says, can we use like very short codes from or off the internet? Yeah, like 1 to 3 lines, of course. It's no different to the assignment in terms of the plagiarism stuff. You can use a few lines of code, totally fine. It's more just like, we don't want you going copy, like you just can't go and copy huge swaths of stuff. Cool. Anything else? I'm going to ask, just to avoid me going on repeat, if you have any questions about the final exam, ask them in the next minute, and then I'll go and answer them all. Let's not play chicken and egg for too long. I'm happy to talk for hours, but I just don't like the lecture being a series of 1-minute pauses. Waste people's time. One more thing. Jay says, like you mentioned just before, it's the final pushed file that was uploaded to GitLab that will be assessed. Yes, exactly. So it's whatever's on master at 5 p.m. That's it. So at 5 p.m. we take whatever's on all your master branches. Mike says, so like the sample exam, we just need to deal with the 3 viewport sizes. Yep. That is exactly true. But remember, it's only worth 20%. So, if that stresses you out, you can actually just focus on the core functionality. And just ignore that 20%. Remember, it's a 20% exam. So 20% of a 20% exam is pretty small. Like even if you get 40% of a scaled mark, which is pretty low in this exam, you're looking at, you know, not a big impact on your mark. Um, Jay says, will there be partial marks for whatever works? Well, generally, if you think about the way this is written, there's kind of very clear small amounts of marks. So generally, it's kind of all or nothing because we've broken it up into things that kind of work or don't work. So what I'd say is like, you know, just a lot of this stuff is either you'll do it or you won't. So it's like tick, cross, so not really partial marks, but it's super granulated too, like 1 mark, 1 mark, you know, 2 marks, 2 marks, etc. So it's kind of nicely broken up. You don't have to stress about how it's marked because it's really clear. It's the same. This is the exact same thing we give the tutor. Ian says, where can we find the sample exam repo? It's linked at the bottom of the exam page on Eccles. You can see it right down here. You can just click on a sample exam paper can be found here. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate that. I enjoy teaching this course, so thank you for being a whole bunch of great students. I think everyone this term's done a really good job keeping the head above water, so really happy to hear that. If there are no more questions, let's wrap up. If you do have more exam questions, please post on the forum. We'll get those answered on the forum. Other than that, thank you for the good term. And yeah, that's about it. I'll chat to you all soon. And we'll I'll keep in touch as we email through for various things. Cool. Well, thank you everyone. Have a good evening.